There is a place where Scotland ends and the sea begins, not gently, the way a river meets the shore, but violently, with cliffs that drop 200 feet into black water and winds that have been known to knock a grown man off his feet. On the northernmost tip of this coast, on an island barely half a mile wide, stood a lighthouse. It had been there since 1811, built from granite hauled across the sea by men who believed that light could save lives, and for 36 years the light had never gone dark. Not once. Not in the worst storms the Atlantic could send. The man responsible for that record was Alistair McRae. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that men who spend their lives listening to the ocean tend to become. He had been keeper of the Dunmore Headlight since 1829, when he was a young man with steady hands and a wife who loved the sound of the sea. His wife Moira had died 11 years ago, fever. There was no doctor on the island, and by the time a boat could cross from the mainland, she was gone. Alistair never spoke of it, but anyone who looked at him carefully could see it, the way grief had settled into his bones like salt into wood. After Moira's death, Alistair raised their daughter alone. Her name was Isla. Isla McRae was 24 years old, and she had never lived anywhere but this island. She had never seen a city. She had never been to a dance or a theatre or a market with more than 3 stalls. She had read about these things. Her mother had left behind 2 trunks of books, and Isla had read every single one, some of them 4 or 5 times, but she had never experienced them. What she knew was the sea. She knew its moods the way other women knew the moods of their husbands. She could read the color of the sky at dawn and tell you whether a storm was 1 day away or 3. She knew how to trim a wick so the flame burned steady for 8 hours. She knew the tide charts by memory. She knew which rocks were visible at low tide and which ones hid just beneath the surface, waiting. She knew these things because her father had taught her, not as a lesson, but as a life. From the time she was old enough to climb the lighthouse stairs, Isla had been her father's shadow, and now she was his eyes. 3 months ago, Alistair had been repairing the lamp housing when a metal bracket snapped loose and struck him across the face. The wound healed, but his left eye went dark completely, and the right one clouded to a fog that made even familiar shapes uncertain. He could no longer see the flame clearly enough to keep it. He could no longer read the logbooks or identify ships or watch for signals from the mainland. He told no one. And Isla, without being asked, stepped into his place. Every evening at sunset, she climbed the 112 steps to the lantern room. She trimmed the wicks, polished the reflectors, filled the oil reservoirs and lit the flame. Every 4 hours through the night, she climbed again to check the light. Every morning at dawn, she extinguished it, cleaned the glass and recorded the night's weather in the log, in her father's handwriting, which she had practiced until it was indistinguishable from his own. No one on the mainland knew. As far as the Northern Lighthouse Board was concerned, Alistair McRae was still the keeper of Dunmore Headlight, because a woman could not be. It was 1847, and in 1847, certain things were simply not permitted. The storm came on a Tuesday in November. Isla had seen it building for 2 days, a darkness on the western horizon that grew wider with each hour, like a bruise spreading across the sky. By noon, the wind had turned. By 3 in the afternoon, the sea was white. Waves that had been rolling gently against the rocks were now smashing into the cliffs with a force that shook the ground beneath her feet. Isla brought the chickens inside. She secured the shutters. She carried extra oil up to the lantern room. 4 trips up those 112 steps, with cans that weighed nearly as much as she did. Her father sat in his chair by the fire, listening. "How bad?" he asked. Isla looked out the window. The sky had turned the color of iron. "Bad," she said. "The worst since I can remember." Alistair was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Light the lamp early tonight. Don't wait for sunset." She didn't argue. 9 o'clock that night, the storm had become something Isla had no name for. The wind wasn't just howling, it was screaming, a sound so high and constant that it stopped sounding like wind at all and became something alive. Rain hit the lighthouse walls like gravel. The building itself groaned. Isla was in the lantern room, watching the light sweep across the darkness when she saw it. A shape in the water, then a light, a flare, brief and desperate, swallowed almost instantly by the waves. A ship. She pressed her face against the glass, straining to see. Another flare. Closer now. The ship was being driven toward the rocks she knew by name, the ones that hid beneath the surface like teeth. "No," she whispered. She ran down the stairs. 112 steps, her boots slipping on the wet stone. She grabbed the lantern from the kitchen table, the rope from behind the door, and the heavy oilskin coat that had been her father's. "Isla." Her father's voice stopped her at the door. He couldn't see her, but he knew. 36 years of keeping the light had given him an instinct for disaster that went beyond sight. "There's a ship on the rocks," she said. "You cannot go out in this. If I don't, they'll die." A silence. The wind filled it. "Take the rope," he said. "Tie yourself to the post at the eastern dock. If the sea takes you, at least we'll find your body." It was the most frightening thing her father had ever said to her, not because of the words, but because of how calmly he said them. He wasn't being cruel, he was being practical. He had lived on this island long enough to know what the sea was capable of. Isla tied the rope around her waist and stepped outside into the storm. She couldn't see. The rain was horizontal, and the wind stole her breath the moment she opened her mouth. She moved by memory. 20 steps to the path, 40 steps down the slope, 15 steps to the eastern dock. The rope unspooled behind her like an umbilical cord. The dock was underwater. Waves crashed over it every few seconds, and Isla had to time her movements between them, running forward when the water retreated and bracing herself when it returned. She tied the rope to the iron post and looked out into the darkness. The ship was closer than she'd expected. It had struck the outer reef, and its hull was broken. She could see the mast tilting at an angle that meant the vessel was already lost. But in the water between the reef and the shore, she could see shapes. People, clinging to debris. 3 of them. She counted again. 3. Isla McCrae was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 8 stone. She was not a large woman. She was not a strong woman, not in the way the world measures strength. But she had spent her entire life on this island, and she could swim in water that would drown most men. She waded in. The cold hit her like a wall. November water in the North Atlantic is not cold the way winter air is cold. It is cold the way death is cold. Absolute, total, beyond argument. Her muscles seized, her lungs locked. For one terrible moment, she couldn't move at all. Then she could. The first man she reached was unconscious, floating face up on a piece of decking. She grabbed his collar and pulled him toward the shore, fighting the current with every stroke. It took her nearly 15 minutes to cover a distance she could normally swim in 2. She dragged him up onto the rocks above the waterline and went back. The second was a boy, no older than 16, clinging to a barrel and screaming words she couldn't hear over the wind. She took his arm and pulled him, and he fought her at first, too panicked to understand that she was trying to help. She shouted in his ear, "I've got you, hold on to me, I've got you." And eventually, he went limp and let her swim. She dragged him to the rocks and went back a 3rd time. The last one was the hardest. He was farther out, beyond the reef, and the current was pulling him away from shore. Isla swam until the rope around her waist went taut, and she realized she had reached its end. She could go no farther without untying herself. She thought of her father's words. "If the sea takes you, at least we'll find your body." She untied the rope. She swam. It took her 20 minutes to reach him. He was conscious but barely, holding onto a piece of the ship's railing with one hand. When she reached him, he looked at her with an expression she would never forget. Not just surprise, but something deeper. Disbelief. As if he had already accepted that he was going to die, and the sight of another living person was a violation of something he'd made peace with. "Hold on to me," she said. "You're..." He stared at her. "You're a woman." "I'm aware," she said. "Hold on to me or drown. Those are your options." He held on. Swimming back was the hardest thing Isla had ever done. Harder than climbing the lighthouse stairs in the dark. Harder than forging her father's handwriting. Harder than pretending every single day that she was not the one keeping the light. But she did it. She dragged him up onto the rocks next to the other two, and then she sat down in the rain and shook so violently that her teeth cracked against each other. 3 lives. She had saved 3 lives. And no one would ever know it was her. The unconscious man died before morning. His injuries were too severe, broken ribs that had punctured a lung. Isla sat beside him in the kitchen as his breathing became shallow, and then stopped, and she held his hand because there was no one else to hold it. The boy's name was Colin. He was 15, an apprentice sailor from Edinburgh on his first voyage. He had a broken arm and terror in his eyes that would take weeks to fade. Isla set his arm with splints she made from driftwood and strips of linen, the way her mother's medical book described. The third man was James Whitfield, 32 years old, a naval surgeon returning to Britain from 3 years stationed in Calcutta. He had a gash across his forehead, 2 cracked ribs and hands that wouldn't stop trembling, though whether that was from the cold or from something older, Isla couldn't tell. He was tall, dark-haired, with a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so closed. His expression, even in pain, was one of careful control, as if he had decided long ago what the world was allowed to see of him, and he maintained that boundary with discipline. For the first 3 days he barely spoke. He accepted food. He let Isla change the bandage on his head. He watched her with those careful eyes, cataloguing everything. The way she managed the house, the way she cared for her father, the way she climbed the stairs every evening at sunset and didn't come down until after dark. On the 4th day, he spoke. "You're the keeper," he said. It wasn't a question. Isla was pouring tea. Her hand stopped. She looked at her father, asleep in his chair, and then at James. "My father is the keeper," she said. "Your father is nearly blind." Silence. The fire crackled. "I'm a surgeon," James said quietly. "I've spent 3 years treating soldiers, sailors, and villagers with every affliction imaginable. I know what failing eyesight looks like." He can barely see the cup in front of him. Isla set the teapot down. Her heart was beating very fast, but her voice was steady. "If anyone finds out," she said, "we lose everything. The position, the house, the only life he's ever known. The only life I've ever known." James looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. "Your secret is safe," he said. "You saved my life. That's not a debt I take lightly." It was the beginning of something neither of them expected. James healed slowly. His ribs kept him from moving easily, and the headaches from his wound came in waves that left him pale and silent for hours. But he was a doctor, and doctors make terrible patients, so within a week, he was insisting on making himself useful. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen door that had been broken since September. He reorganized the medical supplies that Isla kept in a box under the stairs, adding items he'd brought in his surviving luggage: sutures, laudanum, a set of surgical instruments wrapped in oiled cloth. He examined Alistair's eyes gently and thoroughly and told Isla the truth. The damage was permanent. The right eye might stabilize but would never improve. The left was gone. Isla had known this. Hearing it confirmed was different from knowing it. "He'll need someone," James said carefully. "Not now, perhaps, but eventually. Someone to be here." "I'm here," Isla said. "I meant someone the lighthouse board recognizes." She turned away from him and didn't speak for the rest of the day. The weeks settled into a rhythm. The mainland was too far for a winter crossing in a small boat, and the next supply vessel wasn't due until March. They were marooned together. Isla, her father, James, and young Colin, whose arm was healing well but whose nightmares were not. It was James who sat with Colin at night, when the boy woke screaming. Isla heard them through the walls. James's low, calm voice talking about nothing important, about birds, about the stars, about the streets of Calcutta, until the boy's breathing slowed and he slept again. She began to understand that James's silence was not coldness. It was a wall built around something wounded. In Calcutta, he told her one evening, he had treated soldiers with cholera, children with smallpox, women abandoned by their husbands to die in the streets. He had seen more suffering in 3 years than most people see in a lifetime. "There are things you can't unsee," he said. They were sitting on the bench outside the lighthouse door, watching the sunset. "They stay in you. They change the shape of who you are." "I know," Isla said, and she did. She had watched her mother die in this house. She had held a stranger's hand this very month as he took his last breath. James looked at her, really looked at her, not with his doctor's eyes that catalogued symptoms, but with something more open. "You're remarkable," he said. "You know that, don't you?" "I'm a woman who trims wicks and polishes glass," she said. "There's nothing remarkable about it. You saved 3 lives in a storm that should have killed you. You run a lighthouse that the government says you're not allowed to run. You forged your father's handwriting so convincingly that professional inspectors haven't noticed. And you sit here telling me you're not remarkable." He paused. "Either you're very modest, or you've been alone so long, you've forgotten what you're worth." Isla didn't answer, but something in her chest shifted. A door she had kept closed for a very long time opened just slightly. They didn't fall in love the way it happens in stories. There was no single moment, no declaration, no dramatic confession. It happened the way dawn happens, so gradually that you don't notice the darkness fading until suddenly the world is full of light. It was in the small things, the way he handed her a cup of tea every morning without being asked, the way she started leaving a candle burning in the window of the kitchen on the nights she knew his headaches were bad, the way their conversations grew longer and longer, stretching from dinner into the late evening, until one of them would realize with surprise that hours had passed. He told her about London, about the medical school where he'd trained, about the professors who doubted him, about the operating theaters where he'd learned to keep his hands steady while a man's life hung on every cut. He told her about India, the colors, the heat, the beauty, and the cruelty of empire. She told him about the island, about her mother's books and the worlds they'd opened in her mind, about the night she saw the northern lights reflected in the sea and thought the water was on fire, about the loneliness that wasn't sadness exactly, but a kind of weight she carried so constantly, she'd forgotten it was there until someone else arrived, and she felt for the first time what it was like to set it down. In February, a letter arrived. The supply boat came a month early, driven by unusually calm weather. Along with provisions, it brought mail, including an official letter from the Northern Lighthouse Board, addressed to Alistair McRae. Isla read it to her father with James beside her. The board was sending an inspector. His name was Mr. David Hargrove, and he would arrive in early April to conduct a full review of the Dunmore Head Station. This was standard procedure. It happened every few years, but the letter mentioned concerns raised by recent reports about the condition of the light. Someone had noticed something. Perhaps the handwriting in the logs was slightly different. Perhaps a passing ship had seen something unusual. Perhaps it was nothing more than bureaucratic routine. But it didn't matter. An inspector was coming, and an inspector would see within minutes that Alistair McRae could not operate the light. "We have 6 weeks," Isla said. Alistair said nothing. He sat very still, the way he did when he was thinking deeply. James spoke. "I could stay," he said, "until the inspection. I can present myself as an assistant, a friend of the family who offered to help, while Mr. McRae recovers from a minor illness." "And after the inspection?" Isla asked. What then? Another lie to maintain? Another year of hiding? It would buy time. Time for what? Her voice was sharper than she intended. Time to find a man to replace me? Time to pretend that I haven't been doing this job, doing it well, for months? The room was quiet. I don't want more time, Isla said. I want the truth. The 6 weeks that followed were the most complicated of Isla's life. James began teaching her things she didn't know she needed, how to speak to men of authority in a way that commanded respect without provoking hostility, how to present facts in a sequence that made an argument feel inevitable rather than confrontational. You'll only get one chance, he told her. If Hargrove dismisses you in the first 30 seconds, you won't get him back. You need to make it impossible for him to dismiss you. How? By being so prepared, so thorough, so undeniably competent that the only argument against you is your sex. And then you make him say that out loud. Make him stand in the lighthouse you've kept burning through the worst storm in 20 years and tell you to your face that you can't do the job you're already doing. Isla stared at him. That's a dangerous strategy. All honest strategies are. Mr. David Hargrove arrived on April the 7th, 1848, on a grey morning that smelled of rain. He was a thin man with spectacles and a notebook, and he climbed off the boat with the expression of someone who had better places to be. Isla met him at the dock. She was wearing her best dress, the only one without patches, and her hair was pulled back tightly. Her hands were clean, her posture straight. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "welcome to Dunmore Head. I'm Isla McCrae. I'm here to see the keeper," Hargrove said, already looking past her toward the lighthouse. "Your father. My father is inside. He'll be happy to meet you, but I'd like to show you the light first, if you'll allow me." Something in her tone, its steadiness perhaps, or its quiet authority, made Hargrove pause. He looked at her properly for the first time. "Very well," he said. Isla led him up the 112 steps. She showed him the lamp, cleaned, polished, the brass gleaming. She showed him the reflectors, each one aligned to the exact angle specified in the board's manual. She showed him the oil reserves, fully stocked and organized by date. She showed him the logbooks with every entry complete, every measurement accurate, every weather observation detailed. Then she showed him the storm record from November. She had written it herself. Not in her father's hand this time, but in her own. A separate document, precise and factual, detailing the storm conditions, the shipwreck, and the rescue of 3 survivors. Hargrove read it in silence. When he finished, he looked up. "Who wrote this?" "I did." "And who performed this rescue?" "I did." "And who has been keeping this light?" Isla held his gaze. "I have," she said. "Since September. My father was injured. His eyesight is severely impaired. He can no longer perform the duties of keeper. I have been performing them in his place. That is a violation of—" "I know what it is a violation of," Isla said. Her voice did not waver. "I also know that the light has not gone dark. Not once. Not during the worst storm this coast has seen in 20 years. The ships that passed this point, every one of them, did so safely, guided by a light that I kept burning." She paused. "You can dismiss me, Mr. Hargrove. You have that authority. But if you do, I want you to look at this lamp, at these logs, at the record of 3 lives saved, and tell me to my face, that I am not capable of this work. Not because of my competence, which is documented in every page of those books, but because of what I am." The lighthouse was very quiet. Only the wind outside and the slow tick of the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens. Hargrove removed his spectacles. He cleaned them on his coat. He put them back on. "Miss McCrae," he said, "I have been an inspector for 14 years. I have visited 37 lighthouses across Scotland. I have never, not once, seen a station maintained to this standard." He closed his notebook. "I will be filing my report with the board. I expect there will be a discussion." He stayed for 2 days. He examined everything. He interviewed Alistair, who told the truth, all of it plainly without excuse or apology. He spoke with James and Colin, both of whom testified to the rescue. When he left, he shook Isla's hand. It was a small gesture, but it was not small at all. Inspectors did not shake the hands of keepers' daughters. James was supposed to leave on the same boat as Hargrove. His passage to London had been arranged. His family was expecting him. His career, suspended by 3 years in India and a shipwreck in Scotland, was waiting to resume. He didn't leave. He told himself it was because of Alistair's eyes, that as a doctor, he couldn't in good conscience leave a partially blind man on an island without medical support. He told himself it was practical, reasonable, professional. Isla didn't ask him why he stayed. She was afraid that if she asked, he would have to think about it, and if he thought about it, he would realize he should go. So they didn't speak about it. They continued as they had been, sharing meals, sharing conversations, sharing the quiet intimacy of 2 people who had become essential to each other without ever naming it. The weeks passed. April became May. The island, which had been grey and brutal all winter, began to soften. Wildflowers appeared in the grass around the lighthouse. Seabirds returned to the cliffs. The light in the evenings lasted longer, and Isla and James sat outside until the sky was dark, not talking, just being. Colin left on the May supply boat. He hugged Isla so tightly she thought he might break her ribs. He had grown during his months on the island, taller, yes, but something else too. The nightmares had stopped. The terror in his eyes had been replaced by something calmer. "I'm going to be a lighthouse keeper," he told her as he boarded the boat. "When I'm old enough." "You'll be a good one," she said. She watched the boat until it disappeared, and then she climbed the stairs and lit the lamp, because that was what she did. That was who she was. In June, the answer came. The letter bore the seal of the Northern Lighthouse Board. Isla's hands trembled as she opened it. James stood beside her. Alistair sat in his chair, his clouded eyes turned toward the sound of paper unfolding. "Read it," her father said. Isla read. The board acknowledged the irregular circumstances at Dunmore Head. It noted Mr. Hargrove's report, which described the station as exemplary, and the rescue of November 1847 as an act of extraordinary courage and seamanship. It further noted that Mr. Hargrove had recommended, in the strongest possible terms, that the board reconsider its policy regarding female keepers. The board, after deliberation, had decided to grant Isla McCrae a provisional appointment as assistant keeper of Dunmore Head Light, effective immediately. The appointment would be reviewed after 1 year. If the station continued to meet the board's standards, the appointment would be made permanent. It was not everything. It was not the title of full keeper. It was not an acknowledgement that she had already been doing the job alone for 9 months. It was careful, cautious, hedged with conditions. But it was a door, cracked open, just slightly. And Isla knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent her life watching the sea, that once a door opens, even a crack, the wind eventually blows it wide. She set the letter down. "Well?" her father asked. "They said yes," she whispered. And then, louder, with a smile that broke across her face like sunrise, "They said yes." Alistair McCrae, who had not cried when his wife died, who had not cried when he lost his sight, who had not cried in 36 years of keeping a light through every storm the Atlantic could send, Alistair McCrae put his face in his hands and wept. Now there was no reason for James to stay. The thought settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Neither spoke it aloud, but they both felt its weight. James had a life waiting for him, a career, a family in London who hadn't seen him in 3 years, patients who needed him, a future that had been planned before he'd ever heard the name Isla McCrae, before he'd ever seen a lighthouse or swum in freezing water, or sat on a bench at the edge of the world watching the sun go down. He couldn't stay on an island. He was a surgeon, not a fisherman. There was nothing for him here. Except her. The night before he was to leave, they stood together at the top of the lighthouse. The lamp burned behind them, sweeping its beam across the dark water. Below, the sea was calm, the kind of calm that comes after months of storms, as if the ocean is exhausted and needs to rest. "I should say something," James said. "Something eloquent, something worthy of this." He gestured vaguely at the light, the sea, the sky full of stars. "You don't have to say anything," Isla said. "I know, that's what makes it harder." Silence. The light turned. "Will you write to me?" he asked. "Every week," she said, "and I'll actually send them." He smiled. It was the first time she'd ever seen him smile like that, open, unguarded, without the wall he kept so carefully in place. "I'll come back," he said. "Don't promise that." "I'm not promising. I'm telling you what's going to happen." Isla looked at him. She wanted to memorize everything, the way the lamplight caught the angles of his face, the sound of his voice against the wind, the warmth of him standing beside her in the cold. She wanted to keep it all, the way she kept the light. "Then I'll be here," she said. He left the next morning. Isla watched from the top of the lighthouse as the boat grew smaller and smaller against the grey water, until it was nothing but a speck, and then nothing at all. She stood there for a long time after it was gone. Then she climbed down the stairs, and she trimmed the wicks and she polished the glass, and she recorded the weather in her own handwriting, because the light still needed keeping. He came back in September, not because he had to, not because she'd asked, but because some distances, once crossed, create a pull that no amount of reason or responsibility can resist. He came on the supply boat with a trunk of medical supplies, 3 crates of books for Isla, and a letter from the Royal College of Surgeons explaining that Dr. James Whitfield had been granted a leave of absence to establish a medical practice in the Scottish Highlands, where doctors were desperately needed, and the nearest hospital was 60 miles away. Isla was in the lantern room when she saw the boat approaching. She didn't recognize it as the supply vessel at first. It was too early in the month for that. She raised the telescope to her eye and scanned the deck, and there he was. She didn't run. Isla McCrae was not a woman who ran. She climbed down the 112 stairs steadily. She walked to the dock steadily. She stood at the water's edge and watched the boat come in steadily, but her hands were shaking. James stepped off the boat and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away and they looked at each other, the way 2 people look at each other when they've spent months trying to convince themselves that what they feel isn't real, only to discover, in the first second of seeing each other again, that it is more real than anything else in the world. "You're early," she said. "I couldn't wait," he said. He set up his practice on the mainland in a village called Thurso, where the people were suspicious of a London doctor, but grateful for one all the same. He crossed to the island when the weather allowed, which in Scotland meant sometimes twice a week, and sometimes not for a month. It wasn't a conventional arrangement. People talked, they always do. A woman running a lighthouse, an English doctor visiting an island where no one was sick. The gossips of Thurso had enough material to last years, but Isla and James had both survived things far worse than gossip: storms, shipwrecks, wars, the particular loneliness of people who carry their wounds silently and meet, against all odds, someone who understands. Alistair McCrae passed away quietly in the spring of 1850, in his chair by the fire, with the sound of the sea coming through the open window. He was 64 years old. Isla was beside him. His last words were not dramatic or poetic. He simply said, "The light, Isla," and she said, "It's burning, Father. It's always burning." 2 months later, the Northern Lighthouse Board made her appointment permanent. The letter addressed her as Keeper McCrae, not assistant, not provisional. Keeper. She was the first woman in Scotland to hold the title. James and Isla married in the autumn of 1850 in a small ceremony at the lighthouse, with the sea as their witness and the light burning above them. He continued his practice on the mainland. She continued keeping the light. They built a life that belonged entirely to them, not to the expectations of the age, not to the rules that said what a woman could or could not do, not to the conventions that insisted love must look a certain way. Their life was their own. Unconventional, imperfect, shaped by storms and silence and stubbornness and grace. Isla kept the Dunmore Head light for 31 years. In all that time, the light never went dark, not once. When she finally retired in 1878, the Lighthouse Board sent a letter of commendation. But the tribute that meant the most to her came from the sailors, hundreds of them over the decades, who passed Dunmore Head in the dark and saw the light sweeping across the water, steady and sure, and knew they were safe. They never knew who kept it, but the sea did.